exactly what happened. You lifted the price, and the price then ultimately made foreign suppliers almost kind of not care about the tariff anymore. They still made the same. They still made the same money. Where it gets different then is if you also have a quota. That is, if you don't just impose a tariff, but also impose restrictions on how much metal you can actually ship to the US. And then I think it starts to potentially hurt some of the suppliers outside the US. Yes.
And isn't the thought process, though, that he may, this is the man who talks about the art of the deal, and we saw last week those tariffs he was going to impose on Canada and Mexico got paused at the last minute. Is this part of a negotiating tactic? And if so, what does that look like? And second of all, he did have exemptions, didn't he, first time round? Are we expecting the same again?
Yeah, look, on Canada and Mexico, clearly, I think we have indications now that the tariffs then were part of a broader negotiation strategy. I think the issue that you also have is just imposing tariffs on two countries is that the US or other producers could have actually shipped to the metals to the US that are tariff exempt. So ultimately, you wouldn't have gained that much protection from those tariffs. I think imposing tariffs broader on a lot of countries is a very different proposition, a very different proposition now. Could he again bring forward exemptions? Potentially. I think that's what he did in 2018 then as well, and I think Biden took that then a step further, which watered down some of the initial tariffs in the end.
Yeah, and I'm just saying, as you're speaking there, Michael, the EU saying in the last couple of minutes that a spokesperson says that reciprocal tariff ideas, the EU Commission saying that the measures outlined by Washington essentially were not justified. It'll be interesting to see if these tariffs do get imposed, what the response will be. For the time being, though, Michael, really appreciate your time and your analysis this afternoon, or this morning, rather. That's Michael Widmer there, Head of Metal Research at the Bank of America. OK, let's talk about farming, though, because Britain's farmers are getting on their tractors and hitting the road again today to protest outside Parliament. It's part of the continuing campaign against the government's changes to inheritance tax rules. MPs will debate the issue this afternoon after 148,000 people signed a petition calling for the current exemptions to remain. Let's speak to Tom Bradshaw, president of the National Farmers Union, who is in Westminster for us. Tom, this is now one of a series of protests that we've seen the NFU be involved in over the last couple of months. Doesn't seem to have changed the dial, though, does it?
Well, I think the government ultimately have to listen. Today's event is being organised by Liz Webster and Save British Farming. I'll be there speaking to the farmers in attendance. There's going to be hundreds of tractors to continue to raise the pressure on government to listen. We know the impacts on farming and the potential long-term consequences for food production. We've got a government recognising the importance of economic growth, recognising that food security is national security. But at the moment, they're doing everything they can to disincentivise farmers to invest for the future. That simply cannot be right for those farming families or the country as a whole.
Have we worked out, or any closer to how many farmers are affected by this inheritance tax change? There's been a lot of figures bandied about. You've got one figure way over here, the government's got one figure over there. The dust has settled a little bit. Do we know how many families might well be affected?
Well, the government are looking at historic agricultural property relief claims. And unfortunately, first of all, there's been a lot of inflation since then. But secondly, they must massively underestimate the value of the estates, because the answer was always going to be zero inheritance tax payable. HMRC was saying just use the simplest form of balance sheet that you can. So they misrepresent the value of those farms. The crux of the issue here is the returns from food production are just too low. Only about a 0.5% return on capital. There simply isn't the money to pay the inheritance tax. And at any moment that you have to break up a business to pay the inheritance tax, it's not personal wealth that you're taxing at that point. And that is the real challenge that we're facing here. Many farms would have to sell off their assets, would make themselves less viable by trying to pay the inheritance tax in the first place.
Yeah, Tom, just explain this to me, though. I read today that 68% of farmers are aged over 55. Why not hand those farms over to the children now? Like, why wait until... I mean, unfortunately, people have died. Why not just pass on Wouldn't that help to a degree if you passed your farm on to your children while you were still alive, before you or when you retire?
There are many people that are able to plan ahead if you think you're going to live for 7 years. But the people I'm most concerned about are the emails I receive from grandchildren worried about their 94-year-old grandfather, the 90-year-old widowed farmer who's lost their husband 20 years ago, who have no ability to plan.
No, but Tom, I suppose my point is, but we're now at a stage where we know this is going to change. I know there's the 7-year rule, but people can plan, can't they?
Not if you're 90 or 94. There's absolutely no way you can plan, and that's why this policy is
How many 94-year-olds are running their own farm?
But they were told until the 30th of October, the very best tax advice was to keep your farm until death. The Chancellor has not given those families the time to prepare. They are caught in the eye of an inhumane storm, and it's simply not acceptable for the government to have a tax on unplanned death or the elderly. And that's where we've ended up at.
Just explain to me then about the idea behind this, from what I understand, is, I mean, do you welcome what James Dyson has done, which, other people seem to have done as well, or the suggestion, at least anyway, is people would claim, I'm sure they would deny it, is that people are buying up lots of land, essentially, because it is a way of not having to pay this inheritance tax, which has actually pushed up the value of farmland and squeezed out the so-called family farmers.
If there was a genuine intention from the Treasury to try and target those people that are using land as a tax haven to pass down intergenerational wealth that's been made outside of farming, we will work with the Treasury to close that loophole. We would much prefer that this income tax, this inheritance tax, should be paid when the cash is available. It shouldn't be paid on the inheritance of the farm because there is no cash available to pay that tax. So we are very happy, and we've offered since the second week of November to work with the Treasury to close the loophole that you're talking about. But so far, the Chancellor has still refused to meet.
And Tom, just very finally on this, I'm saying this as, someone who essentially grew up on a farm, and a lot of people watching at home will think this. They'll think, whether it was the common agricultural policy, whether it's blaming the supermarket, whether it's now this inheritance tax, have farmers ever been happy? I mean, there's always a grievance, there's always a protest, it seems.
I don't think there's been protests like this in my lifetime, if I'm honest with you. Well, maybe back in the early 2000s, but that was more about just the attack on rural life than it was about farming and food production. We've got the third cheapest food in the world here. We want to produce safe, affordable food for the consumers. But at the moment, the government haven't got the policies in place. And look, this is the straw that's broken the camel's back. But there is one thing that the Labour government can do today, which is to consult on the changes they plan to make to inheritance tax to make sure that it targets the people that they want to target. At the moment, it is targeting the working family farmers that produce 75% of this country's food, and there is no ability to pay that tax. Now, we want food security. We know that we need food security to deliver for national security, but at the moment, the government are not incentivising farmers to invest for the future of food production.
OK, Tom, as always, really appreciate your time this morning. Tom Bradshaw there from the NFU. Just bringing some breaking news coming into us at Sky Centre in the last couple of minutes, and that is that Ashley Dalton, who's the Labour MP for West Lancashire, has been appointed as the new Health Minister in the Labour government after, of course, Andrew Gwynn was resigned, or was sacked, actually, I should say, at the weekend after he sent a string of offensive and abusive messages in a WhatsApp group. Obviously was a health minister, got sacked, and Ashley Dalton, the MP for West Lancashire, will take over that new role. Let's bring you up to date with the rest of the business stories now. And new subsidies have been announced for Drax, the UK's biggest power station, which the government says will halve costs for consumers and improve sustainability. Drax, a former coal-fired plant, which now burns wood pellets, is currently paid to generate electricity using wood that must be 70% sustainable. That figure will rise to 100% by 2027 under the new deal. Lidl says it'll increase hourly pay for 28,000 workers next month. The supermarket chain says the rise will be more than 50p higher than the government's minimum wage rise, which comes into force in April. Lidl says it's part of a £50 million investment in pay and its 970 stores and warehouses. Now, the cost of tying the knot is soaring, with the average cost of a wedding up by 11% in the last year. Research by the wedding website Hitch found that the average wedding now costs £23,420. The majority of wedding budgets were spent on the venue, the average of around 8,800 quid. Catering was the second biggest expense, costing an average of £6,400 for a wedding with 80 guests. And that doesn't include the all-important wedding cake, which I swear no one eats at a wedding, but that cost apparently an extra £360. Zoe Burke is editor of Hitched, who carried out that survey. So 11% in a year, that's a hell of a lot of money.
It is, but it is going on the best day of your life.
Well, you know, maybe for some more than one of their best days of their lives, but we'll talk about that another time. Just explain why it's going up so much in value.
So there are a few different factors at play here. Obviously, the biggest one is going to be the cost of living. We know that, you know, everything is getting more expensive over time. And weddings aren't immune to that. They're made up of lots of small businesses. And when you look at a wedding cake, as you just mentioned, the cost of eggs, the cost of butter, that's increased. And when you're making a cake to serve, the average wedding guest number now is 89 people. You need a lot of eggs and butter. So that pushes the price up.
And it pushes it up so much that, yet again, of course, families are having to step in with respective parents helping to contribute, aren't they, to the cost of people's weddings?
Yes, we are seeing people rely on contributions from friends and family, but that's not too far from the actual traditional approach where the bride's family paid for the whole thing initially.
Does that still hold? Or are parents on both sides willing to spend more? Or is it still the father of the bride who pays for most of it?
It's very much a joint effort now. Both sides tend to contribute, and the couples themselves as well tend to save a portion of the costs.
I think what's really interesting as well is that, according to your survey, 57% of couples now opt for what are called DIY elements to the wedding. What is that?
So that's where you take on some of the details yourself. And it's not for the faint-hearted. You will be doing things like making your own table arrangements, perhaps, trying your hand at making your own cake, making your own stationery. It's something I wouldn't recommend to people unless they are very confident in their creative skills, because it can be quite a lot of work.
Now, we talked about the average there being 23,000, which is a hell of a lot of money, but that is the average, which means that there's quite a lot of people spending a hell of a lot of money on a wedding. Give us some examples of some of the stories that you've heard about people spending a lot on a very big wedding.
Yeah, so we know that 1 in 10 couples actually spend over £40,000 on their weddings. And do you know what? It's easily done. If you want the perfect venue, you know, some of the places you can get married at, stately homes, you can get married at royal palaces, the cost reflects the location. And a lot of people now are having multi-day weddings as well, which increases the price too.
Yeah, I know. I've been to a few weddings that seem to have turned into a weekend rather than one simple day. What would you say to people watching at home saying, it's ridiculous? Yeah, it might be the best day of your life, but people getting themselves into debt or not being able to afford a mortgage because they feel the need to spend so much money on what is, at the end of the day, still just one day of your relationship.
So I would say I would never advocate for anyone getting into debt for getting married. But when you consider a wedding is made up of lots of small independent businesses and you're investing in lots of different elements. So when you break the costs down and you think about all the things that go into a wedding and the people's time, you know, they're making your cake from scratch, they're making floral arrangements from scratch, you've got fresh local catering being produced on a large scale. It's easy to see actually where the money goes and why it does cost what it does. But anybody who is struggling with the idea of spending the money, I would always say pick your priorities and focus on those, because there's nothing you have to have at a wedding necessarily. There's all stuff that we want to have, but if it's something that doesn't feel right to you, put it to the bottom of the list and focus on the things that make your wedding day feel more true to you as a couple and worth the money.
And my advice, Zoe, would be just don't bother with the cake. No one ever eats it. Because it gets to the point where... Well, no, because the thing is, I think by the time they cut the cake, which is normally well after dinner, people are full, a little bit tipsy, and kind of on the dance floor. No one eats it. I swear no one eats it.
I like it for breakfast the next day.
Oh, OK. Well, there you go. Wow. Zoe, thank you very much indeed for your time. Zoe Burke there from Hitched. Thank you. And just to let you know that you can find out more about that and indeed the rest of the business money news on our money blog. Just scan the QR code that's on your screen right now to access that on the Sky News website or indeed on the Sky News app. You're watching Business Live on this Monday morning. Coming up next, we'll be looking at how the markets are doing. The FTSE up a bit today. All the details after this quick commercial break.
It's like a football final with only one team on the pitch. This isn't just a call to vote, but a call to remember. The freedom fought for by the African National Congress.
I'm Yusra Al-Bagher, Sky's Africa correspondent based in Johannesburg, South Africa.
A cyclone and 2 burst dams wiped out hundreds of generational homes.
This was the second dam that the floodwaters hit before it tore into Derna. We are in the heart of Nairobi, and we're watching as protesters were heavily tear gassed.
The sheer fearlessness and persistence of these guys is astonishing.
We help you understand the world with us. I remember going into the iconic Omdurman market in the heart of Sudan's capital for the first time since the war started. And this is what's left of it. Bullet holes through buildings, shelled balconies, bullet cases on the floor. I witnessed the complete destruction of a place linked to my childhood memories and the lives of millions of people. This is insane. This was a bustling residential area. So many friends who lived here. My most memorable interview was with a 15-year-old boy who'd survived being stranded on a migrant boat on its way from Senegal to the Canary Islands.
After 13 days, our food, water and fuel supply ran out.
I felt awe when we saw the mountain gorillas in Rwanda.
We call him the king of the jungle. This is the alpha silverback.
Sky News, get the full story first. Yusra Al-Bagher, Sky News.
Weeknights on Sky News.
This is your chance. Tell people. Welcome to the Politics Hub.
Our police force has apologised. If you wanted to find out about Grimsby, you come to the docks.
I'm live in Jerusalem.
Are you not concerned that that could lead to all-out war?
Hello there, good evening. There are fears of an upsurge in violence. What's at stake here?
You are watching the press preview, a first look at the front pages as they arrive.
Slide Emirates, slide better.
Slide Emirates, slide better.
Very welcome back. Well, let's have a look at those markets in a little bit more detail. Concerns about that trade war knocking the global economy have taken the heat out of oil prices for 3 weeks in a row. But Brent crude, as you can see, is trading up this morning at just over $75 a barrel. That's despite the prospect of more Trump tariffs. Meanwhile, the financial markets in general not reacting, frankly, very much to the latest threats. Maybe because of those last-minute U-turns we saw last week on Canada and Mexico. Stocks in Asia largely positive overnight, despite hits to some metal-focused shares. In London, FTSE also up a fraction this morning, just over 0.5%. Meanwhile, if we look at the currencies, the pound barely moved, down a minor fraction against the dollar, and it is bang on 120 when it comes to the euro. Let's speak to Ross Mould, Investment Director at AJ Bell. Ross, always a pleasure. Let's start with Trump tariffs. I fear it's not the first time, it won't be the last, but the markets don't seem to be reacting very much.
Good morning to you, Darren. No, they're taking it with a degree of calm. I think, first of all, China only putting tariffs on less than 10% of its imports from America Some have seen that as a little bit of an olive branch, and they're 10 to 15%, so not as high as some of the tariffs that Trump is imposing on steel and aluminium over the weekend. So China's seen as making a bit of an effort perhaps to say that there is room for talks here. And on the American side, as you suggested, I think a lot of investors see Trump as taking a position, a bargaining position, rather than necessarily something that will stick for a long period of time, or at least that's the hope. And that's why the major Asian markets held up reasonably well. And in fact, the big export-driven markets like Taiwan, Korea, Japan, all rallied quite strongly to close flat or up by the end of the day's play.
Yeah, it might be interesting that kind of the markets are seeing Trump's bark worse than his bite, but we'll see the detail. He says a little later on today, but let's see. Talk to me about BP, which is up today. What's going up? I think 6%. What's going on there?
Yeah, it's top of the FTSE leaderboard. There are reports that I'm not sure are entirely confirmed that the major American investor Elliott has taken a stake in the company. Elliott is known as it's a value investor. It looks for shares that have underperformed, and then it does tend to try and be involved in companies where something's going to change to unlock the value that they think's there, and that's not always a coincidence. Elliott may make proposals to a company, and if they don't get listened to, they might go public and get quite aggressive about it, and even seek representation on the board to see that their ideas are at least given a very fair hearing, if not implemented. So they can go activist if they want to, and generally speaking, when they do, the things do tend to happen. And if you look at a classic activist roster of suggestions, spin off an asset, break up the company, put it up for a bid, change the management, there's lots of things that they can get involved with. And after BP's marked underperformance for the last 4 or 5 years, I think investors are looking for strategic clarity from the company. Does it really want to be a big hydrocarbon producer? How is it going to manage the transition to renewables, and how quickly? And there's a capital markets day coming up at the end of the month, so a lot of pressure on boss Murray Auchincloss to deliver there, and perhaps keep Elliott at bay.
Ross, we all know, don't we, that at times of uncertainty, people tend to flock to gold, and that's no different this time.
No, $2,900 an ounce today. That's a new all-time high. Whether that's because of the uncertainty over Trump, tariffs, trade, whether it's because fears that tariffs will lead to inflation or stagflation, or there is this talk coming out of America from Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent that America may look to revalue the assets it has, the gold assets it has on its balance sheet. They're currently in at $42 an ounce, not $2,900. And if you did put them up to the current market value, you conjure about $800 billion out of the air and make America's debt look less bad relative to its overall assets and GDP. So lots of reasons filtering around for why gold may be doing well, but net, it is, and it's doing so without getting an awful lot of press, actually, which is quite interesting.
And finally, Russ, I mean, I could spend all day talking about the cost of a wedding cake. I couldn't do the same about the Super Bowl because, frankly, I don't understand it. So can you explain to me, and this is even more complicated, what's the relationship between the Super Bowl and the S&P?
Okay,
or is there a relationship?
First of all, Darren, my wedding cake was a pork pie triple-decker, so and everybody ate it.
Now you've won me over. And I bet you that didn't cost 350 quid.
And it disappeared, even more importantly. Secondly, the Super Bowl rule, the National Football League's in two halves, national and American conferences. The old story was if the team from the national side won, the S&P 500 did better in the following year. And that average does bear out. Over the last 58 years, 10% gain under when an NFC team wins, 8% when the AFC team wins. The NFC team won last night, Philadelphia. So if you believe in that little bit of market magic, then that might bode well for the US this year. What I would say is the last time Philadelphia won in 2018, that was the year that Trump first got tucked into tariffs and trade wars, and the American index actually had a down year. So we'll see what happens.
Well, there you go. Ross, always a pleasure. You made me hungry now with that pork pie cake, I'm not going to lie. Thankfully, it's lunchtime. Russ, thank you very much indeed. Russ Moll there from AJ Bell. Thank you. OK, that's it from me on Business Live for this morning. Of course, we're back at 4:30 this afternoon with more on business news. Do join me then if you can. Up next, though, it's the very latest news headlines. Gareth is back at midday. Stay tuned for that, and I'll see you a little later. Goodbye.